The courtroom in Asheville was dead silent. You could hear the breath catch in people's throats as a 6-year-old girl walked slowly down the center aisle, her shoes tapping rhythmically against the polished wood floor. Her name was Sophie Morris. Her dress, faded pink with a small tear near the hem, floated slightly as she moved. She looked too small to be so brave, too young to be carrying the kind of weight she was about to place on everyone's shoulders, but she wasn't trembling. She reached the bench, her chin barely high enough to peek over it, and placed both palms flat against the wood. Her green eyes met the gaze of Judge Margaret Whitlow, a woman known across Buncombe County for her stern demeanor and her unwavering commitment to the law. Sophie's voice, soft but certain, rang out in the silence like a bell. "Judge," she said, "if you let my daddy come home, I'll help you walk again." A single gasp rippled across the room, then laughter. First a cough, then a stifled chuckle. And then it grew scattered, confused laughter from people who didn't know whether to feel uncomfortable or amused. The kind of laughter people give when something makes them nervous because it might be true. Judge Whitlow didn't laugh. She didn't blink either. She stared at Sophie as if she had just seen something unexplainable, something that didn't fit the tidy confines of law books and court procedures. A few reporters scribbled notes. One leaned in to catch the girl's voice on her recorder. Caleb Morris, seated behind the defendant's table in a borrowed blazer, 2 sizes too big, stood up halfway in protest, but the bailiff gently shook his head. Caleb sat back down, helpless, eyes full of something between fear and awe. In that stillness, in the middle of that polished southern courtroom, something shifted. No one knew it yet, but this little girl had just changed the entire temperature of the room, of the case, of the town. This is the story of what led up to that impossible moment, and how it ended. 3 weeks earlier, the world was quieter, simpler, at least on the outside. Judge Margaret Whitlow was finishing her morning espresso in the sunroom of her restored colonial, high up on Sunset Drive. The windows were spotless. The floors gleamed. Her calendar was meticulously ordered, just like her rulings. The judge's life, to anyone looking in from the outside, was a portrait of respect, wealth, and success. But when she rolled back from the glass table in her chair, she paused. She could still hear the echo of music. Not in the air, music hadn't played in her house for years, but in her memory. She remembered what it felt like to wake up and dance barefoot across the floor, twirling to Nina Simone in her nightgown. Before the accident, before her body betrayed her. Now, her mornings were clinical. Brush, sit, sip, sign. Lana had left a neat folder at the edge of the table. Margaret flipped it open. The Morris case. Theft. Parent. Minor involved. Possible plea. She sighed. A handyman caught taking over-the-counter medication from a local wellness pantry. Claimed it was for his daughter's asthma. No prior offenses. Single father. She skimmed the details. Desperation dressed up as justice, she muttered under her breath, tapping her pen against the folder's corner. Her words were cold, but her hand trembled slightly when she reached for the second page. Lana returned with a reminder. 10:30, court docket. Margaret nodded. In 15 minutes, she would be wheeled into her courtroom, the same place she'd handed down over 1,000 sentences since her injury. No one had ever touched her heart. That was about to change. Across town, in a 1-bedroom rental above a shuttered gift shop, Caleb Morris was combing his daughter's hair. Sophie winced as he gently worked through a knot. "Sorry, Peanut," he murmured. "You've got magic in these curls, but they sure like to fight back." Sophie giggled. Maybe the knots are hiding secrets. Caleb smiled faintly, but the weight behind his eyes didn't lift. He hadn't slept. Not well, anyway. Not since the night he'd found Sophie struggling to breathe, her tiny chest wheezing with every intake of air, and realized he couldn't afford another refill of her inhaler. The free clinic was closed for the weekend. His last job had been delayed, money hadn't come through. The wellness pantry on College Street had always helped when things got tight, and the door was usually open to families in need. He'd left a note, explained everything, But someone had reported the entry as trespassing. That was enough to bring charges, enough to make him look like a thief. Now he was headed to court, his daughter in tow. She insisted on coming. "I have to be there," she said. "I need to look the judge in the eyes." Caleb didn't argue. She had a way of saying things that didn't invite disagreement. Not in a rude way, just a knowing one, like she already saw the full picture and you were catching up. On the walk to the courthouse, Sophie held his hand, swinging their arms back and forth. "Daddy," she said suddenly, "I'm not afraid of the judge." Caleb raised a brow. "No?" "Nope, she's just sad. You can feel it. Her legs are sad, but her heart's even sadder." He stopped walking. "Sophie," he said gently, "don't say stuff like that in front of people. It sounds strange." She looked up at him, eyes serious. "But it's true." He couldn't argue. He didn't understand her sometimes, but he'd seen things, small things that made him wonder. The time she sang to Miss Velma when her arthritis flared up and the woman claimed her pain had eased the next day. Or how the neighbor's grieving dog followed Sophie around like she was a warm blanket come to life. Still, court was real life, not storybook time. And then came the moment. Inside that high-ceilinged chamber of wood and brass, Sophie did the unthinkable. She walked right up to the judge. On her own. Her voice had sliced through the air like sunrise cutting fog. The gavel never came down. Judge Whitlow sat in her chair, frozen. The courtroom buzzed with disbelief, stifled chuckles, raised brows. And still, the girl stood tall. "I'll help you walk again." Margaret Whitlow stared at her as if the world had tilted. And maybe it had, because nothing in the judge's 30 years on the bench had prepared her for this. Not the law, not logic, not even grief. What she felt now wasn't something she could name. But deep in her chest, where she hadn't allowed herself to feel much of anything for a long time, something stirred. Hope, or maybe something even more dangerous. Belief. If you enjoyed this video, comment 1 to let me know. If not, comment 2. Your thought mattered to me either way. The wind had a bite to it that morning, the kind of chill that crept beneath your coat collar and lingered on your skin even after you stepped inside. Caleb Morris stood at the edge of a job site on the north end of Asheville, hands buried deep in his jacket pockets, watching a crew assemble scaffolding around a half-renovated inn. He wasn't on the schedule today. That was the problem. 2 weeks prior, he'd been offered regular work there, restoring handrails, refinishing hardwood floors, carpentry tasks that steadied his income. But since the arrest, the calls had stopped. Polite excuses at first, then silence. He watched for a few more seconds, then turned and walked toward the main road. The sun caught the edges of the Blue Ridge Mountains in the distance, but the view didn't ease the knot sitting in his chest. His boots scraped against the gravel. "Sophie needs her meds refilled in 2 days," he murmured to himself. "Rent's due Friday, groceries tomorrow." It wasn't just the money, it was the shame, the judgment painted on people's faces. Soft as it was, especially in a place like Asheville, where people prided themselves on politeness cut deeper than any words. He wasn't a thief. He had done what any father would have done if their child was struggling to breathe. But the system didn't always care about reasons. The system wanted clean answers, tidy boxes, correct forms. Caleb had none of those. He paused outside Harvest and Hearth Cafe, hesitated, then stepped inside. Warmth and cinnamon drifted in the air, along with the quiet hum of conversation. A bell above the door jingled gently as it shut behind him. A few heads turned. A woman at the counter glanced up, her expression shifting for a moment, not unkind, but uncertain. That look, he'd been seeing it more and more. Like they weren't sure whether to smile or avoid him altogether. "Morning, Caleb," she said, after a beat, straightening her apron. He nodded politely. "Hi, Harper. Is, Miriam here?" "She's in the back," Harper replied, glancing toward the kitchen. "You want me to let her know you're asking?" "If she's not too busy, I just need 2 minutes." Harper disappeared behind the swinging door. Caleb stood awkwardly, hands still in his pockets. The clink of dishes and low jazz filled the quiet. He noticed a couple in the corner, whispering. One of them looked his way, then looked away. His jaw tightened, just slightly. The door swung back open, and Miriam Solano emerged mid-40 seconds, always dressed like every moment mattered. She had that rare combination of poise and kindness. But this morning, she looked tired. "Caleb," she greeted, voice neutral but not cold. "Miriam," he said, almost softly. "I was wondering if there's still any work you might need help with this week. Anything at all. Fixing shelves. Sanding that porch rail you mentioned last month. Anything." She hesitated. That pause told him everything. "Look, I know things are complicated now," he said, his voice catching a little. "But I need to keep working. I need to take care of my daughter." "Caleb," she said gently, stepping closer so her voice stayed private. "It's not that I don't want to help. It's just, I have a business to protect. People are talking." He gave a slow nod, swallowed hard. "She didn't have her inhaler, Miriam. I wasn't thinking about stealing. I was thinking about whether she was going to make it through the night." Her eyes softened, but her hands folded tight in front of her. "I believe you," she said. "I do. But people make assumptions. You know how this town is." He did. He always had. After a few more strained words, he thanked her anyway and stepped back out into the cold. The wind felt sharper now. As he walked toward Sophie's school, he couldn't stop the reel of thoughts spinning in his head. How fast a man could fall, not from crime or recklessness, but from one impossible choice, the thing no one talked about. The quiet kind of collapse that came from doing what you believed was right, and still losing everything. He arrived just in time to see the kids being led inside after recess. Sophie turned at the sound of his voice and ran to the gate with that same spark in her eyes, her curls bouncing with every step. "Daddy!" He caught her in his arms and pressed his cheek to her forehead. "You good?" he asked, checking her coat, her gloves, her breath. She nodded eagerly, then leaned close. "You smell like worry," she whispered. He blinked. "I do?" Sophie shrugged. "Just a little." He smiled despite himself, brushing a leaf from her shoulder. "Guess I should wear cologne next time." She giggled. Then her face shifted. Serious now. She reached into her backpack and pulled out a small piece of paper. "What's this?" he asked. "I wrote a letter to the judge," she said. "Miss Velma helped me spell the long words." Caleb unfolded it carefully. Sophie's handwriting, wide and neat, danced across the page like a song. It said, "Dear Judge Lady, I think your legs are asleep because your heart is tired. But I can help. Because when people believe again, their legs remember too. My mommy used to say love is louder than pain. I think that's true. I hope you believe too. Sophie." He didn't speak for a moment. Then he folded the note and tucked it carefully into his coat. "Sophie." She looked up at him, waiting. He cupped her face. "You're not supposed to be the brave one. That's my job." She leaned into his palm. "It's okay. We can take turns." Later that night, while Sophie colored at the kitchen table, Caleb sat alone on the small balcony outside their apartment. The porch light flickered. Below him, the town moved in quiet rhythms, cars passing, dogs barking in the distance, porch lights blinking on one by one. He held the letter in his hand, and for the first time in days, he allowed himself to cry. Not because he felt broken, but because somewhere deep inside, he didn't feel entirely alone anymore. Behind him, Sophie's voice rose in song, soft, slow, a lullaby he hadn't heard since her mother passed. The same one she used to sing when the house felt too quiet, a melody made of memories, and something about it, about that night, and that sky, and the promise hanging between one girl and one judge, felt like the first flicker of something new, not certainty, not even hope, but possibility. And sometimes that was enough. Judge Margaret Whitlow sat at the far edge of her sunroom, the morning light barely touching her legs. The glass panels framed the soft hills of Asheville like a moving painting, one she hadn't stepped into for nearly 4 years. Her wheelchair was angled slightly toward the window, though she wasn't looking at the view. She was holding Sophie's letter, again. She'd already read it 5 times since yesterday. Her eyes traced the curving letters, the crooked spelling, the strange, beautiful way it flowed like a prayer. She wasn't sure what disturbed her more, the absurdity of the promise, or the part of her that wanted to believe it, the part that had no place in a courtroom. Margaret set the letter down and rolled herself back to the center of the room. Her house was immaculate, museum-like in its arrangement. Not a cushion out of place, not a speck on the hardwood floors. But the stillness in her home wasn't peace, it was containment. And the silence was armor. She'd built this life carefully after the accident, with walls, schedules, rules. Emotion was an old pair of shoes she'd left by the back door. Love? That was even further gone. Since her injury, romance had become a story other people lived, something she watched from the outside like a woman standing behind glass. Until Sophie, until that courtroom. Free my dad, and I'll help you walk again. Margaret closed her eyes, trying to silence the memory. But the child's voice echoed louder in her ears than any gavel ever had. Her intercom buzzed. Yes? Judge Whitlow. Her assistant Lana's voice came through, clipped and polite. Cole Bennett is here. He says it's about the Morris case. Margaret straightened. Send him in. Moments later, Cole Bennett, the town's district attorney, stepped into her office, carrying a leather folder and a storm of opinions. He was handsome in that southern gentleman way, salt and pepper hair, clean jawline, expensive cologne that somehow smelled like both mint and confidence. But Margaret knew that beneath the charm, Cole was ruthless in court, methodical, disciplined, the kind of man who didn't believe in gray areas, only rules. He sat down across from her with a sigh, tapping the folder against his knee. Margaret, he began, skipping the usual formalities. We need to talk about what happened in court. She arched a brow. We are talking. He narrowed his eyes, not amused. You let a child walk up to your bench and make a public promise that you, of all people, are entertaining. Do you realize how that looks? I didn't entertain anything, she said calmly. I delayed sentencing, which is well within my authority, for 30 days, based on a 6-year-old's wish. He leaned forward. You're risking your reputation, your credibility. Margaret, this isn't like you. She folded her hands, voice low but firm. I'm aware. Then why? That stopped her. Because the truth, she didn't know how to say aloud. Because something in that little girl's eyes had broken through every brick wall she'd built around her grief. Because when Sophie said she could help her walk again, something inside her flickered, and she hadn't felt that flicker in years. I made a call, she said finally. Cole studied her. You made a call, he repeated. You made a call that has the entire courthouse buzzing, donors raising eyebrows, and half the town thinking you've lost your edge. Margaret's eyes didn't waver. And the other half? He paused. They think you found your heart again. That landed like a quiet punch. Margaret's breath caught. Just for a second. Cole saw it. He softened. Just slightly. You were the sharpest mind in this city, Margaret. Still are. But you haven't been the same since the accident. That courtroom isn't just where you work. It's who you are. Don't let one child rewrite your whole legacy. She's not just any child, Margaret said. Cole tilted his head. You believe her. It wasn't a question. Margaret looked out the window again. I believe, she said slowly, that something about her feels different. I don't know what it is. But for the first time in years, I didn't feel like a shadow of myself when I looked at her. Cole went quiet. Then, to her surprise, his tone shifted. "Do you remember that night at the Arboretum?" he asked. She turned, confused. "What? 3 years ago, right before the fall. The charity gala. We danced for almost an hour before they even served dessert." Margaret blinked. That memory had been tucked away, half buried. "I remember," she said. "You laughed that night," Cole said. "A lot." I'd almost forgotten what it sounded like. The air changed between them. Something long dormant stirred just beneath the surface, unspoken, but not forgotten. They had danced. They had gotten close. But after her accident, she'd shut every door, including that one. Margaret didn't answer. "I only bring it up," Cole said gently, "because I know what it looks like when your heart's open. And you weren't wrong to pause the sentencing. But be careful with this girl. Don't start hoping for things you've already made peace with losing." Margaret's voice was almost a whisper. "I never made peace with it." The silence that followed was thick. "I'll see myself out," Cole said quietly. But as he stood, he paused. "For what it's worth, I want the girl to be right." She didn't speak. After he left, Margaret rolled herself toward the grand piano in the corner of the room. It hadn't been played in years. Dust lay soft across the keys. She reached out, let her fingers rest on the ivory, and pressed one note. It rang out, pure and lonely. She closed her eyes. In the stillness, the sound of Sophie's voice returned. Not loud, just present. "You don't need to walk to be whole. But if you believe, your body might remember joy." Margaret exhaled slowly. That night, while the city lights flickered below her, she took Sophie's letter from her lap and placed it on the piano, like a promise waiting for music. And maybe, just maybe, for a new beginning. If you enjoyed this video, comment 1 to let me know. If not, comment 2. Your thought mattered to me either way. The hallway outside courtroom B smelled faintly of lemon polish and old paper, a scent that stuck in your clothes longer than it should. Caleb sat on a hard wooden bench with Sophie beside him, her legs dangling, shoes not quite touching the floor. She was humming softly, scribbling in a notebook with a broken purple crayon. He wasn't sure how she stayed calm. His palms were sweating. His tie was crooked. His heartbeat felt like it was knocking on the inside of his ribs, trying to get out. This was the hearing, not the trial, not yet, but the moment everything could shift. He knew that much. Sophie didn't. Or maybe she did. A soft click of heels approached. Caleb looked up to see Angela Wren, his court-appointed attorney, weaving through the hallway crowd like someone who had long ago run out of patience but not professionalism. "Caleb," she said, voice clipped. "You ready?" "As I'll ever be," he replied. Angela crouched down to Sophie's level. "Hey there, sweetheart. You doing okay?" "I'm fine," Sophie said, not looking up. "My daddy's nervous, though." Angela blinked. "Well, I guess that's fair." Sophie tore a page from her notebook and handed it to her. It was a drawing of a woman with glasses and a long black robe standing beside a tall tree. "That's the judge," she said. "And that's her heart. I drew it big so it doesn't forget how to grow." Angela gave a slow, stunned smile. "Thank you, Sophie. That's beautiful." Then the courtroom doors opened, and everything changed. Inside, the room felt colder. Maybe it was the air conditioning, or maybe it was the energy tense, anticipatory, like the hush before a thunderstorm. Reporters sat in the back row, pens poised. A few townspeople had gathered out of curiosity, including Miss Velma, sitting quietly in her Sunday hat like she was in church. At the front, Judge Margaret Whitlow was already seated, her expression unreadable, her fingers resting lightly against the bench, her robe perfectly pressed, not a strand of hair out of place. She looked composed, except for her eyes. Her eyes followed Sophie the moment she walked in. And when the little girl passed the bar and took a slow step toward the bench again, the whole room held its breath. Caleb opened his mouth to call her back, but stopped. Sophie turned to the judge and said clearly, "I meant what I said. I can help you." A murmur swept through the room. The clerk banged his small gavel once to silence the whispers. Judge Whitlow's lips parted slightly. But instead of responding to Sophie, she looked out at the room. "This is a preliminary hearing regarding case number 40783, State of North Carolina versus Caleb Morris," she began. "Today, we will review the details, consider a possible delay in sentencing, and—" She paused, her voice caught, just for a moment, "and address a rather unusual request made during our previous appearance." Cole Bennett stood. "Your Honor, with respect, I'd like to formally object to the idea that this courtroom entertain a deal proposed by a 6-year-old child with no legal standing." Judge Whitlow nodded slowly. "Noted. And yet, here we are." Cole's jaw tightened. Angela rose. "If I may, Your Honor, my client's daughter was not attempting to interfere with legal process. She made a heartfelt appeal during a deeply emotional moment. She made a proposition." Cole cut in. "That's not emotion. That's manipulation, whether innocent or not." Sophie turned toward him. "I didn't try to trick anyone." Cole blinked. "I just believe she can heal," she added. "And I think maybe you forgot how to believe." Dead silence. Even the stenographer hesitated, fingers hovering over her keys. Judge Whitlow leaned forward. "Miss Morris," she said, her tone not unkind, "can you tell me what you mean when you say you can help me?" Sophie nodded. "I don't have magic, if that's what you mean. But I can sit with you, talk with you, touch your hands, and maybe remind your body what it forgot." Whitlow stared at her for a long moment, then said, quietly, "And what makes you think my body forgot anything?" "Because," Sophie said, her voice soft, "your eyes look like they miss dancing." Margaret's lips parted. For a moment, she looked like someone had hit rewind on her life and played a memory she wasn't ready to see. She blinked hard, looked down at her papers, composed herself. "I'm postponing sentencing for 30 days, she said at last, her voice sharp again. "During that time, Mr. Morris will remain under community supervision. His daughter will not be removed from his custody unless there's reason for concern. We will reconvene at the end of the term for final judgment." Cole shot to his feet. "Your Honor, my courtroom," she snapped. "My discretion." She looked at Sophie, then back to the room. "This court is adjourned." She slammed her gavel down. The sound echoed like thunder. People didn't move right away. Caleb sat frozen, jaw slack, staring at his daughter, like she'd just bent time. Angela leaned in. "Well, that's not how I thought this would go." Caleb finally breathed again. "What just happened?" Sophie smiled up at him. "We got 30 days. He knelt beside her. "Sweetheart, that's not a win. That's just a delay." "I know," she said, "but it's enough." "Enough for what?" She looked toward the bench, now empty, and whispered. At the front of the room, Judge Whitlow had paused behind the side curtain. She stood still, her hand pressed against the wall for support. She hadn't planned to say yes. She hadn't planned to feel anything at all. But something about that little girl's eyes, clear, kind, unwavering, had stirred something in her that no verdict ever had. Not hope. Not yet. But maybe the first flicker of it. And that was dangerous. Because if it was real, if this child could somehow reach her, it meant everything she'd built to keep her heart protected might have to be torn down. And she wasn't sure she was ready for that. Not again. The next morning, Judge Margaret Whitlow didn't rise at her usual hour. She sat awake in bed, staring at the sunlight, filtering through the sheer curtains. It spilled across her legs, untouched, like it always did. But today, the warmth felt different, almost like invitation. She hadn't told anyone what she'd felt the night before. Not Lana, not her doctors, not even Cole. That brief flicker in her feet, a warmth that danced just below the skin, not pain, not tingling, just life. She dismissed it, of course. Logical explanations were her foundation. She didn't believe in emotion guiding action, let alone unexplained sensations tied to a child's touch, but still, she couldn't shake it. She pressed her fingers into her lap and whispered to the quiet, "What are you doing to me, Sophie Morris?" Across town, Sophie was setting the table for breakfast. She placed the plastic bowls just so, added spoons, and folded the napkins into triangles, which she called fancy style. Caleb watched her from the kitchen doorway, sipping weak coffee and trying not to think about the bills on the counter behind him. "You okay, Peanut?" he asked. She nodded. Judge Whitlow's heart started moving yesterday. "Oh, yeah?" Caleb smiled weakly. "How do you know?" "Because when I touched her hand, I felt it kick. Like a baby heart. Scared, but awake." He exhaled. "That's poetic." Sophie tilted her head. "It's true." He walked over, ruffled her hair. "Even if it is, we still have work to do. You ready for school?" "Miss Velma's walking me," Sophie said. "She said she wants to pray over the sidewalk while we walk, to make sure my words don't get lost." Caleb chuckled. "That sounds about right." A knock came at the door. Caleb froze slightly. He wasn't expecting anyone. When he opened it, Cole Bennett stood there, hands in his pockets, looking like a man who'd rather be anywhere else. "Mr. Morris," he said, "mind if we talk?" Caleb stepped outside, closed the door behind him. "I wasn't expecting you," he said, guarded. Cole nodded once. "Didn't want to come. But Judge Whitlow asked me to drop off this." He handed him a manila envelope and "Keep an eye on your compliance." Caleb opened the envelope. Inside was a list: court-approved service hours, mandatory check-ins, random home visits. It was official. The 30 days had begun. "I understand," Caleb said, jaw tight. Cole didn't move. "Can I say something without getting your guard up?" Caleb raised an eyebrow. "You can try." Cole glanced back at the apartment door, then lowered his voice. "I don't know what your daughter did in that courtroom, but Margaret hasn't been herself since. And I don't mean that in a bad way." Caleb's brow furrowed. "She's been softer," Cole admitted. "Not weak, just awake. And part of me is glad. But another part of me knows it's dangerous to let hope back in when you've made peace without it." Caleb looked him straight in the eye. "Sounds like you care a lot about her." Cole didn't blink. "I do." Caleb didn't speak for a moment. Then, "So why'd you walk away after the accident?" That landed hard. Cole's jaw flexed. "Because she closed every door. And I respected that." "But did you knock?" Caleb asked quietly. The silence stretched between them. Finally, Cole said, "Look, I'm not here to dig up ghosts. Just keep your daughter grounded. She's young. And Margaret's been broken for a long time." Caleb narrowed his eyes. "Sophie doesn't break people." Cole turned, started down the steps. "No. But she might wake them up." And with that, he was gone. That afternoon, Margaret wheeled herself into the therapy center at Street, Claire's rehabilitation facility, a place she'd stopped visiting 2 years ago after her doctors had said permanent. She wasn't sure what made her return today. Curiosity? Defiance? Or maybe the letter Sophie had mailed to her house that morning, written in sky-blue crayon. Sometimes people stop trying because they forget someone's waiting for them. Margaret had read it 3 times. Now she sat across from a physical therapist named June, warm, energetic, mid-30s, with a soft Carolina accent that made everything sound like encouragement. "We can start simple," June said. "Stretching, gentle stimulation, just to see." Margaret shook her head. Let's do something harder. June blinked. Judge Whitlow, it's been 4 years. I know what it's been. I also know what it hasn't. June studied her, then nodded. All right, let's try standing. You've still got some nerve response. Might surprise us both. They moved slowly. June supported her under her arms as Margaret planted her feet. Her muscles screamed in protest, not pain, but resistance, the kind that came from years of stillness. June counted softly. 1, 2. Margaret groaned through clenched teeth, pushing against gravity like it was a wall. And for the briefest second, she lifted. Just an inch. Just a shift. But she felt it, then collapsed back into the chair, chest heaving. June crouched beside her. You okay? Margaret nodded, tears burning the corners of her eyes, not from failure. From the miracle of almost. From remembering. Same time tomorrow? June asked gently. Margaret gripped the arms of her chair, voice shaky but certain. Earlier. That night, Margaret sat at her piano again. The house was dark except for one lamp glowing in the corner. The room smelled faintly of lavender and dust. She pressed a key, then another. A chord this time haunting, unresolved. She didn't know what she was playing. Only that her hands remembered how to speak, even when her heart didn't know the words. The music drifted out the open window into the night. And 2 blocks away, Sophie stirred in her sleep. Her eyes opened, and she smiled, as if she'd heard the sound, as if she'd been waiting for it. Because she had. The church bell rang noon across downtown Asheville as Caleb stood beneath the old oak tree in Pack Square Park, shifting nervously from one foot to the other. He'd agreed to meet her Judge Margaret Whitlow in a moment that felt more like fiction than fact. Not in a courtroom, not behind robes or rules. Just 2 people and whatever this was. The invitation had come in an envelope with no return address. Tucked inside, a single line, written in clean, slanted penmanship. Thursday. Noon. Pack Square. Let's talk. He assumed it was about Sophie, but the weight in his chest said it might be more than that. He spotted her from a distance, pushed in her chair by a nurse he didn't recognize. She was dressed in soft gray, her hair pulled back neatly, her posture still elegant, despite the wheels beneath her. The nurse stopped at the bench near the statue in the center of the square. Margaret motioned to be left alone, and the nurse walked away without a word. She turned her head slowly and found him. He walked over, quietly, nodded once. She looked up, her expression unreadable. Caleb. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was charged, like the air before a storm that doesn't want to announce itself. Thank you for coming, she said. He sat on the edge of the bench, hands resting on his knees. I wasn't sure if I should. Neither was I, she admitted. Another pause. Then she added, I stood for 3 seconds yesterday. Caleb turned to her, surprised. You stood? She gave a small nod. It wasn't graceful, and it wasn't long, but I felt the floor again. That's incredible. It's terrifying, she said quietly, because now I can't pretend it's impossible. He let that settle. Margaret glanced down at her hands. Your daughter is unusual. She's always been that way. No, she said, voice firmer. I mean, spiritually. There's something about her, like she sees through people, not past them, through them. Caleb looked away for a second. She takes after her mom. Margaret studied him. Do you miss her? Every day, he said, but not just because I loved her. I miss who I was when she was here. Margaret's expression softened. She believed in things I didn't. She used to say, God gives us people to remind us of him when we can't see straight. I didn't really get it then. And now, he met her eyes. Now I'm trying to. They sat in silence again, but this time it felt easier. Margaret broke it. Can I ask you something? Personal? Sure. You could have taken a plea deal. Served time. Made this disappear. Why didn't you? He took a slow breath. Because I didn't do it to get away with something. I did it to save my daughter's life. And if I go to jail, what happens to her? Foster care, system rotation, no one to remind her how to believe in the things her mother did. She looked at him, really looked at him, as if seeing something new. You think the system is broken, she said. I think it's scared of compassion, he answered. That hit something in her. Margaret looked away, her voice quiet now. I used to think the law was the highest moral ground, the great equalizer. But lately, she hesitated. Lately, I wonder if I've been hiding behind the robe because I didn't know how to be human again. Caleb didn't speak. Margaret turned back to him. Your daughter touched me. Not in some mystical way, not like magic, but like... My soul remembered I used to feel things. I used to dance. I used to laugh without permission. Then do it, Caleb said, almost too quickly. Her brow furrowed. Do what? Laugh. Dance. Whatever your version of believing again is. She gave a small, skeptical smile. You make it sound easy. No, he said. It's just simple. Simple isn't easy. Margaret looked down at her lap. I've been afraid to feel anything real, she admitted. Because if I do, and it disappears again, I don't know if I'll survive the emptiness. He nodded slowly. Yeah, that's the thing about love. It's risky. But so is regret. A long silence followed. Then she whispered, You're not like I imagined. How did you imagine me? Angry, defensive, rough around the edges. He smirked. Some days I am. They both laughed quiet, hesitant at first. But it was real. And for Margaret, it was the first time laughter didn't feel like it needed permission. She glanced up at him. What if this 30 days ends? And I still can't walk. Then you're still the same person who stood for 3 seconds. That's more than most people do in a lifetime. She blinked quickly, trying to hold back something deeper. Then, unexpectedly, she reached out a hand. Caleb looked at it for a second before taking it gently in his own. It was warm, soft, alive. Their hands stayed like that for a long moment. Not romantic. Not yet. But something had shifted. Something fragile, pulsing between them, just beneath the surface. Trust, understanding, possibility. Margaret drew her hand back slowly. I should go. The nurse will come looking. Caleb nodded. Thank you for meeting me. Thank you, she said, surprising even herself, for reminding me I don't have to stay buried. She turned her chair, began to roll slowly toward the edge of the square. Caleb stood and watched her go. And for the first time in a long time, he felt something rising inside him. Not pride, not hope, but the slow, steady beginning of connection, and he didn't try to stop it. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the steps of Asheville's old courthouse, stretching like memories across the stone. Margaret watched them from the top of the hill in the adjacent garden, where wildflowers had been left to grow freely, sun-kissed, unruly, alive. Her nurse had offered to push her farther, to keep her close to the paved walkways, but Margaret had insisted on being alone today. She needed the quiet, needed the space to think and to feel. Her hands rested on her lap, her eyes tracing the silhouette of a little girl running through the garden below, her laughter spilling into the air like music. For a flicker of a second, Margaret could almost see herself at that age, braided hair, mud-stained knees, chasing something wild with no fear of falling. How far away that girl felt now. She exhaled slowly, feeling the soft ache behind her ribs that had nothing to do with paralysis, and everything to do with Caleb Morris. Their conversation 2 days ago lingered in her mind like an echo that refused to fade. The way he looked at her, not with pity, not with judgment, but as though he truly saw her, and more than that, believed in her. She hadn't let herself be believed in for a very long time. A gentle breeze stirred the leaves. She leaned her head back, closed her eyes. "You know," a voice came from behind, low and familiar. "I never pegged you for a garden person." She opened her eyes slowly, turning toward the sound. Cole Bennett stood a few feet away, his suit jacket draped over one arm, his expression unreadable. Margaret raised a brow. "I'm not, but today, I wanted to remember what growing things looked like." He gave a dry smile and stepped closer, careful not to crowd her. "Well, you picked a good spot. This garden's been wild since before either of us got our bar cards." She didn't respond right away. "What are you doing here, Cole?" "I could ask you the same," he said. She nodded once. "Fair." A long silence settled between them. Then, he said gently, "Lana told me you've been going to therapy again." She had no right. She didn't tell me as gossip. She told me because she's worried and proud. He stepped closer, kneeling slightly to be at eye level. "I'm proud too," he added. That disarmed her more than she wanted to admit. "You think I'm chasing something impossible?" "No," he said. "I think you're chasing something brave. There's a difference." She studied his face. He looked tired, but honest, and it occurred to her that somewhere between courtrooms and closed doors, they'd stopped being people to each other. Just roles. Functions. Past tense emotions wrapped in professional caution. "Why now?" she asked quietly. He tilted his head. "Why what? Why come here? Why care?" Cole sat on the stone bench beside her, folding his hands. "Because I made a mistake," he said. "I let you go when you needed someone most, and I've spent every year since convincing myself it was the right thing to do. But then that little girl walks into your courtroom and turns everything upside down." "She didn't turn anything upside down," Margaret interrupted. "She just reminded me I was still breathing." Cole nodded. "Exactly. And maybe it took seeing you breathe again to realize I'd stopped too." Margaret looked down at her hands. "You think we could have made it?" Before the fall, he was quiet for a long time. Then, "I think we were close. Closer than either of us wanted to admit. But we were both too proud. And then everything broke. And instead of fixing it, we walked away." She turned to him. "Do you regret it?" "Every day," he said without flinching. "But I'm still here." Her throat tightened. "Is this your way of saying you want a second chance?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. "No," he said softly. "This is my way of saying, I'm not going to disappear this time. Whether you want me as a friend, or something more, or nothing at all, I'm staying." Margaret swallowed the lump, rising in her throat. "You know I can't promise you anything. I'm not asking you to." They sat in silence for a while, the kind that didn't need filling. Below, Sophie appeared on the edge of the garden, walking hand in hand with Miss Velma, pointing at a butterfly that had landed on a thistle. Margaret smiled faintly. "She reminds me of something I forgot." Cole followed her gaze. "She reminds me of something I never learned." Margaret watched as Sophie gently released the butterfly into the air. It lifted, wings shimmering gold in the sunlight, spinning up into the sky like it knew where it was going. "Do you think," she said quietly, "that belief is something we're born with, or something we choose?" "I think," Cole said, "it's something we lose when we're hurt, and spend the rest of our lives trying to remember." Her breath caught. She didn't respond, just watched Sophie dance in the grass, barefoot, fearless. And for the first time in years, Margaret didn't feel like a spectator in someone else's life. She felt present. Not whole yet, but no longer numb. She turned to Cole, her voice quiet. "If I fall again, don't let me shut you out." He looked her in the eye. "If you fall again, I'll be right here to catch you." This time, she didn't look away, and she didn't stop the small smile that crept onto her face. Maybe this wasn't a love story. Not yet. But something was growing between them, and this time, she didn't want to run from it. Margaret sat in the quiet of her living room, the only light coming from the piano lamp casting long, soft shadows across the wood floors. Her fingers hovered over the ivory keys like they were holding a breath too fragile to exhale. She didn't play, not tonight. Not yet. Tonight wasn't for sound. It was for sorting through the mess inside her. Sophie's words from days ago still echoed in her mind about hearts waking up, about remembering how to dance. And then Cole's voice, steady and unexpected, promising not to disappear. She wasn't used to being seen. She was even less used to being believed in, and yet somehow both were happening at once. A soft knock came at the door. She paused, startled. It was late, well past dinner, past what most people considered polite visiting hours. Wheeling toward the entry, she hesitated before opening it. But when she did, there stood Caleb, hair tousled from the wind, holding a brown paper bag in one hand and looking almost sheepish. "I brought soup," he said. "Velma's recipe," she insisted. Margaret blinked, momentarily stunned. "At this hour?" She said, "It's when souls are the most honest." He offered with a soft grin. "Midnight's just truth with a ticking clock." She laughed, caught off guard by his timing and his presence. "Come in," she said, backing her chair up. "I'm not sure if I'm hungry or haunted, but soup seems like a good offering either way." He stepped in, careful not to let in the chill, and followed her to the kitchen. "I didn't mean to intrude," he said, unpacking 2 bowls. "I just couldn't sleep." "Neither could I," she admitted, opening a drawer for spoons. "Too many thoughts." He stirred the soup slowly. "About Sophie?" "About everything," she replied. "Her. You. Myself." She poured water into glasses, her movements practiced but slow, cautious. "I'm not used to things being tender," she said. Caleb met her eyes. "And I'm not used to people who admit when they're scared." She looked down at her lap. "It's not fear, exactly." "Then what is it?" She paused. "It's hope. And how easily it breaks." He handed her a bowl, then pulled out a kitchen chair and sat, folding his hands like he was bracing for something bigger than just soup. "I saw the way you looked at Cole the other day," he said quietly. Margaret flinched slightly, but didn't deny it. "We have history. I figured. You don't look at someone like that without knowing what it used to feel like." They both sipped in silence for a moment. Then she said, "We loved each other once, or thought we did, but it was wrapped in ambition, in identity. We didn't know how to be soft. And now?" he asked gently. "Now he wants to try again, I think." Caleb nodded slowly. "And do you?" She didn't answer immediately. "I want to trust again," she said, "but I don't know if it's him or just the memory of what he gave me before I broke." He watched her carefully. "You're allowed to want more." The words landed softly. She turned to him. "You keep showing up. I told Sophie I would." She smiled. "You didn't tell me. I didn't think you needed me to." He took another sip of soup. Then, quieter, "I don't show up for just anyone, Margaret. But there's something in you that makes people want to stand closer." She stared at him. The air between them changed. "You're not afraid of what I've lost?" she asked. "I'm more interested in what you haven't," he said. "You still play. You still show up in court. You still fight. That tells me you didn't give everything away." The silence stretched again, this time thicker, charged. She reached for a napkin, more to keep her hands busy than anything else. He set his bowl down gently. "Can I tell you something you might not believe?" "Please do." When Sophie touches people, they don't just feel different. They remember who they were, who they could be. Margaret's eyes welled. "That scares me." "Why?" "Because if she's right, and I start to heal, I'll have to choose who I want to become." and I'm not sure I know anymore. Caleb leaned in slightly, voice low and sure. Maybe you just need to be willing. She studied him. You're a good man. I'm a desperate one, he corrected, but desperate men see things clearly. She reached out, almost without thinking, and touched his hand. It was instinctual. Human. Caleb didn't move. The contact was gentle, brief, but enough. I don't know what this is between us, she said, voice barely above a whisper, but it feels honest. He nodded. That's a start. They didn't kiss. They didn't hold each other. But the quiet between them hummed like the beginning of something rare. When he stood to leave, she followed him to the door. Thank you for the soup, she said. Thank Velma. He smiled. She makes it for broken hearts. He stepped out into the night, pausing on the porch. Sleep well, Judge. She hesitated, then answered. Good night, Caleb. The door closed with a soft click, and Margaret stood there for a long time, the warmth of his presence still lingering, not as a distraction, not as a promise, but as a question she was finally ready to ask herself. Could love come again, even now? And if it did, would she be brave enough to answer? The wind carried a soft chill through Asheville's late October air, the kind that hinted at winter without committing. The leaves were finally giving in to the seasoned burnt orange, deep red, paper-thin gold. Margaret sat wrapped in a light shawl, her chair positioned beneath the sugar maple in her backyard, staring at the way the branches moved like they were trying to remember something. She wasn't waiting for anyone, but her thoughts kept drifting to two men, one from her past and one who'd somehow walked into her present without asking permission. Cole had called that morning, left a voicemail, calm and careful. He asked if she wanted to meet for coffee. Said he had something to say, something he hadn't been ready to say before. She hadn't returned the call. Instead, her eyes drifted to the small card tucked into the edge of her kitchen bulletin board. Sophie's handwriting in blue crayon. Every seed knows how to become a tree, even if the dirt forgets. It shouldn't have made sense, but it did. Her phone buzzed in her lap. This time, it was a text from Caleb. Sophie's reading her poem at school today. She wants you there. No pressure. Margaret stared at the message, then back at the trees, then whispered, pressure's never been the problem. She called for her nurse, and within 15 minutes, she was dressed, in the car, and headed toward the elementary school auditorium. It wasn't a grand building. It wasn't even modern. The bricks were faded, the letters on the school sign slightly crooked. But it had life, the kind you can't fake. Inside, the room buzzed with nervous energy. Folding chairs packed tight, parents craning necks, teachers whispering directions. Margaret moved to the back corner, staying out of sight. She didn't want a spotlight. She just wanted to see her, and there Sophie was third row from the front, wearing a pale yellow dress and shiny black shoes, clutching her note cards like they held secrets. Caleb sat nearby, eyes scanning the crowd, visibly tense. When his gaze caught Margaret's, his whole posture shifted. Not a smile exactly, more like a quiet thank you passed between souls. A teacher stepped up to the mic, welcomed everyone, and called the first student. Poems were read. Laughter bubbled. One child even sang part of hers. Then, Sophie Morris, you're up next. There was a small gasp in the crowd, barely noticeable. But Margaret heard it. She knew that tone, the kind of curiosity that dances with doubt. Sophie walked to the stage, her note cards trembling just slightly. She adjusted the mic with help, then looked out. My poem is called The Light Under My Dad's Door. A hush fell. She began, her voice soft but clear. There's a light that shines under my dad's door, every night when I sleep and every day when I'm sore. It's not just a lamp or the kind that you plug, it's the kind that feels warm, like a hug you can't hug. Margaret's throat tightened. He sits in that room with papers and books, with eyes full of tired and hands that still cook. I asked him once why he never turns it off. He said, because hope doesn't knock, baby. It waits for the soft, A few people dabbed their eyes. Even the teacher stood still. So I leave him letters and drawings and crumbs, and he leaves me stories and lunchbox plums. And sometimes, when I whisper to my mom in the sky, I tell her, Dad still shines, even when he cries. Silence. Heavy, reverent. Then a wave of claps rose, not rushed or polite, but slow, genuine, like everyone was afraid to break the moment too fast. Sophie bowed, and in the back, Margaret pressed a hand to her mouth, something breaking open inside her. When the event ended, Caleb moved toward the exit with Sophie's hand in his. She spotted Margaret before he did. "Judge Whitlow!" Sophie squealed, breaking free and rushing over. Margaret leaned down, opening her arms, as the little girl wrapped around her like light itself. "I didn't know you were coming." Sophie beamed. "I wouldn't miss it," Margaret said softly. "Your poem was brave." Sophie nodded. "It's true, too. All of it." "I believe you," Margaret whispered. Caleb approached, a bit hesitant. "You okay?" She straightened in her chair, wiping her eyes subtly. "No, but I'm getting there." He smiled, gently. "Yeah, me too." There was a pause. Then Margaret asked, "Do you have time for tea?" He glanced down at Sophie, who was busy showing another student her crayon-covered note cards. "Only if you're making it," Caleb replied. She smiled. "Good answer." As they walked out into the golden afternoon, Cole stepped out from behind the side door of the school. He hadn't come to confront her. He had come to watch, to see what she would choose, and the answer was clear. She hadn't walked away from him. She was simply walking towards something else. The kettle whistled softly in Margaret's kitchen as the late afternoon sun filtered through the gauzy curtains, casting warm streaks of gold across the countertops. She moved slowly, deliberately, partly because of the chair, but partly because her heart couldn't stop pacing. Caleb sat at the round table near the window, watching her with quiet attentiveness. He hadn't said much since they arrived, letting the rhythm of her space speak first. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was thick with anticipation, a conversation waiting for the right doorway. "You like peppermint?" she asked, her voice carrying just enough tremble to betray her nerves. "I like whatever you're making," he replied. She glanced back, half smiling. Diplomatic answer. "I've had some practice lately." He meant it lightly, but Margaret caught the weight beneath it. The man had been surviving for so long, learning to balance hope and consequence, like two halves of the same breath. She poured 2 cups and wheeled over, setting one in front of him. Her fingers lingered around the rim of her own cup. The warmth steadied her, anchored her to the moment. Caleb cleared his throat. "Sophie hasn't stopped talking about you." "That poem," Margaret said quietly. "It nearly undid me. She wrote it 2 weeks ago, hid it under her pillow, said she didn't want me to see it until she was sure she meant every word." Margaret looked up sharply. "And did she?" He met her eyes. "She always means it. That's what makes her dangerous." He nodded. "She makes people remember how to feel. Once you do that, you can't just go back to numb. You've got to either grow or break." She stirred her tea slowly. "And which did you do?" Caleb leaned back, thinking. "I broke first, then I learned how to grow in the cracks." That hit something deep. Margaret let the silence linger before asking, "What if I'm still cracking?" "Then maybe that's the best part," he said. "That's how the light gets in, right?" She didn't respond, but her grip on the cup tightened slightly. Then, almost reluctantly, she said, "I used to believe in absolute truths. Right, wrong, guilty, innocent. But now, it's all so gray." He nodded slowly. "Gray isn't weakness. It's where empathy lives." Margaret's eyes glistened. She looked away, toward the window. Cole came by again. Caleb didn't flinch. "And?" He wanted to talk. He said he still loves me. Caleb didn't react immediately. He took a sip, then set his cup down with care. And do you love him? I think I love what we almost were, she said. But that version of me, she's gone. And the version sitting here? Margaret's eyes finally returned to his. She's trying to figure out if she deserves to start over. Caleb leaned forward, voice gentle. You don't earn that, Margaret. You just choose it. Her breath hitched. The simplicity of his words was like a match striking dry wood. I didn't come here to get involved, she whispered. Not with you. Not with anyone. I know, he said. But life doesn't ask permission. It just offers you doors. Some swing wide, some creak slow. But they all lead somewhere. She swallowed hard. You're a poet, Caleb. I'm a man trying not to fall apart, he replied, and maybe finding pieces of himself in someone else's kitchen. That stole the breath from her lungs. She looked down, gathering herself. I'm scared. So am I, he said. She blinked. You don't seem it. He gave a quiet laugh. That's only because I've had practice pretending. There it was again, the transparency. The honesty that felt like oxygen after years of filtered air. I like talking to you, she said. He nodded. Then let's keep talking. Margaret hesitated. I don't know what this is yet. It doesn't have to be anything yet, he said. It just has to be real. They sat in silence again, watching the last golden light slip across the floor like a secret. Then Caleb stood. I should go. Sophie's probably charming Miss Velma out of another cookie. Margaret smirked. That child is going to end up mayor someday. She already thinks she's running the town, he chuckled. He paused at the door, hand resting on the knob. Thank you, he said. For what? She asked. For letting me see the version of you that doesn't need a robe. She looked down. That version's still figuring out who she is. Well, he said, opening the door. Whoever she is, I like her. He stepped into the cooling evening air, the screen door closing softly behind him. Margaret sat there for a long time, not thinking, just feeling. And for once, that felt like enough. The courthouse steps felt colder than usual beneath Margaret's wheels as she waited for the bailiff to unlock the front doors. It was barely dawn. The sky was still streaked with blue-gray, and the town hadn't quite woken up. But she had. She hadn't slept more than an hour. Too much turning inside her. Too many words she hadn't said. She watched her breath fog in the morning air and listened to the silence of a town that didn't yet know its heart was about to be shaken. Today was the hearing. Caleb Morris's final review. A 30-day sentence suspended under judicial discretion. A rare clause. Used only in specific cases. And only when the judge believed in redemption over punishment. It had been Margaret's decision, and now it was Margaret's name at the center of the storm. Reporters had started sniffing around last night. An editorial had popped up in the local paper, questioning her objectivity, her sudden change in tone, her judgment. And Cole? He'd left another message. Margaret, I don't know what's going on between you and Morris, but this is going to follow you. Call me, please. She hadn't. Not because she didn't hear the warning in his voice, but because she didn't need saving. Not from Caleb. Not from herself. Not anymore. When the bailiff finally arrived, she nodded politely and rolled past him, her thoughts already 10 steps ahead. By the time she reached the courtroom, her nerves were tight as piano wire. The bench loomed in front of her, its height still imposing after all these years, even from her chair. She settled in, waited, and as the courtroom slowly filled with murmurs and footsteps, she found herself scanning for one face. He came in through the back, hair slightly damp from the morning mist, suit pressed but humble, shoulders squared like a man walking toward something bigger than his fear. Caleb didn't look at her. Not yet. Sophie wasn't with him. Velma had offered to keep her home. Margaret had agreed. Today was for the grown-ups. Today was the storm. The prosecutor, a sharp-featured woman from the state office, stood and adjusted her notes. She wasn't local, which was probably why she didn't hesitate. Your Honor, the defendant's 30-day review has raised significant public concern, including alleged personal bias on your part due to recent personal interactions. Margaret said nothing. I move that we reassign the case for impartiality, the woman continued. There is reason to believe your decision-making has been compromised. The courtroom murmured, soft but rising. Caleb didn't flinch, but Margaret saw it, the tension in his jaw, the quiet brace of his hands. He was ready to take the fall, to protect her. Her fingers curled over the wooden armrest. She took a breath. Motion denied. The prosecutor's brow lifted. Your Honor, I will hear the review, Margaret said, voice clear. And I will offer my judgment, as is my duty. Unless you have evidence of misconduct, your assumptions are not law. The woman hesitated, clearly thrown off. But Saturday. Margaret turned to Caleb, finally meeting his eyes. Mr. Morris, please step forward. He did, slow but steady. State your case. Caleb cleared his throat. His voice was low, but it filled the room. I've followed every term of the agreement, attended therapy, completed the community service hours, and reported weekly. She nodded. And beyond the checklist? He paused. Then I've learned how to listen again, to Sophie, to myself, to what I stopped hearing when my wife died. A hush fell. He wasn't reading from notes. He wasn't trying to impress. He was simply telling the truth. I used to think grief was something you locked away, he continued. But that's not healing. That's hiding. And my daughter, she's been pulling me back into the light, one tiny hand at a time. Margaret swallowed hard. I've failed before, Caleb said, looking around the room. I've been angry. I've been lost. But I am not the same man who walked in here 30 days ago. And if I'm still broken, it's not for lack of trying. He turned to her. And if you think I should serve the full sentence, I'll go. I'll walk into that cell knowing I'm not running from it. Margaret looked at him, really looked. At the humility, the transformation, the courage, and the risk he was still willing to take for her. She could feel every eye on her now, every beat of judgment waiting to land. She could still say the safe thing. She could still protect her title, her career, her image. But something inside her had shifted. She didn't want safe anymore. She wanted true. Mr. Morris, she said, steadying her voice, your progress has been documented and confirmed. Your presence here today is not just an obligation, it's a reflection of character. He nodded, quiet. I find no reason to impose additional sentencing. Your suspended sentence is concluded. Your record will reflect compliance. Some in relief, some in protest. But she didn't care. Not this time. Court was dismissed. As the room emptied, Caleb approached her quietly, almost cautiously. You didn't have to do that, he said. Yes, I did. His eyes searched hers. You're going to face fallout. I've faced worse, she replied. A pause. Then thank you. She looked down at his hand, resting gently on the edge of her bench. She didn't take it. But she didn't pull away either. We're not done, Caleb. He nodded. I know. She wheeled past him, the echoes of her judgment still hanging in the air. She wasn't walking away from the fire. She was walking straight through it, and for the first time in years, she was doing it on her own terms. The air outside the courthouse was thick with quiet judgment. Margaret felt it in the sideways glances from passing attorneys. She heard it in the clipped greetings, the slightly too long pauses when people recognized her rolling down the marble hallway. She'd been called brave before, but this didn't feel like bravery. This felt like being exposed. She'd passed judgment for decades. Now, the whispers weren't about the defendants in her courtroom, they were about her. Still, when she stepped into her car and shut the door, something in her exhaled for the first time in days. She had chosen the hard thing, and she hadn't broken. When she got home, Velma was on the porch, shelling peas in a wide bowl with Sophie at her side. A pitcher of lemonade sat between them, sweating in the early afternoon Sunday. "There's the warrior woman herself," Velma said, eyes twinkling. Margaret raised a brow. "You heard?" "Child, this town runs on gossip faster than it runs on gas." Velma grinned. "But I don't listen to fools. I listen to outcomes. And that courtroom is a little better today because of what you did." Margaret looked at Sophie. The little girl was humming to herself, tapping her bare feet against the wicker chair. "Where's your dad?" Margaret asked. Sophie looked up. "He's fixing the porch step." Margaret blinked. "The one that's been cracked for 4 years." Sophie nodded proudly. "He said if I can write poems, he can learn how to use a hammer." Margaret chuckled despite herself. Inside, she set down her things and rolled into the sunroom. She didn't know what she was looking for, maybe just space to think, but then she saw it. A piece of paper taped to the window, written in crayon. "Dear Judge Whitlow, I saw your eyes in court. You were scared but brave. That's the best kind. Thank you for not making my dad go away again. Love." Margaret touched the paper like it might vanish. There was something disarming about that child, her way of cutting straight to the truth with no detour, no shame. Just pure heart. A soft knock at the back door pulled her from the moment. It was Caleb. He looked more at ease than she'd seen him in weeks, sleeves rolled, hands dusty from work. "Got a minute?" he asked. She nodded, motioning him in. They sat in the kitchen, the same place where so many silent thoughts had passed between them. Caleb rubbed his hands on his jeans, then looked up. "I didn't thank you properly." "You did." He shook his head. "I mean, not just for court. For believing I could be more than what I was." Margaret stirred her tea, thoughtful. "I didn't believe it right away." "I know," he said. "Neither did I." They sat for a while, the hum of the fridge the only sound between them. Then he said, "There's something else." Margaret looked up. "I've been offered a job," he said. "Full-time. Small contracting company out in Hendersonville. It's not much, but it's steady." "That's wonderful," she said, and meant it. "There's more," he added. "They want me to start next week. It's a big commitment." Margaret stilled. "And Sophie? She's the reason I'm thinking of taking it. But she's also the reason you might not." He nodded. Margaret leaned back slightly. "You're afraid she'll think you're choosing work over her." "I'm afraid she'll think I'm choosing to leave. Again." That hit something raw. Margaret looked down at her cup. "Do you want my opinion?" "Always. She'll understand if you explain why. But she needs to know it's for her, not away from her." Caleb breathed deep. "That's what I was hoping you'd say." Another pause. Then he said softly, "You've become part of her world, Margaret." Margaret felt the weight of that. "She prays for your legs," he said, voice thickening. "Every night. Says she wants to see you dance again." Tears welled before she could stop them. "She believes in miracles," he added. "She shouldn't have to," Margaret whispered. "But maybe you should," he replied gently. She looked at him, then really looked. And in that gaze was everything unspoken between them. Hope, fear, something fragile and unfinished. "I don't know how to do this," she said. "Me neither. But I want to try." His voice cracked a little. "So do I." The moment stretched between them, taut with possibility. And then Sophie ran in, holding a dandelion like it was a bouquet. "Dad, Judge Whitlow, I made a wish." Margaret wiped her eyes quickly. "What did you wish for?" Sophie beamed. "That no one I love ever forgets how loved they are." Caleb reached down and picked her up. Margaret smiled. And for the first time in what felt like forever, the silence between them wasn't heavy. It was full. The morning came soft and slow, filtered through cottony clouds that hung low over Asheville. Rain tapped gently against Margaret's windows, not enough to keep anyone inside, but just enough to make you want to sit closer to someone warm. She watched the drizzle from her sunroom, tea cooling in her lap. Sophie's crayon-written letter still taped to the glass, like a promise she couldn't let go of. For the first time in years, Margaret didn't wake to her schedule. She hadn't checked her court calendar, hadn't read the paper, hadn't even listened to the news. She was waiting. Not for a decision, but for a moment. A knock came at the front door. Not rushed, not heavy. She knew it before she opened her mouth. "Come in, Caleb." The door creaked open, and there he was, soaked just at the shoulders, a bag slung over one side. And that look again. Not nervous, not proud, just searching. "Brought muffins," he said, holding up the paper bag. "Pumpkin walnut." She raised a brow, bribing a judge with baked goods. Bold. "I thought I'd try something different," he replied, shrugging out of his damp jacket. They moved to the kitchen, the rhythm between them, so natural now, it felt like muscle memory. She poured the tea. He plated the muffins. Rain painted slow streaks on the windows. "I accepted the job," Caleb said after a beat. Margaret looked at him. "You did?" "Starts Monday. I'll be doing a mix of site work and project coordination. They're even giving me afternoons off on Fridays so I can be home for Sophie." "That's wonderful." "It is," he said, "but it's also terrifying." She nodded. "Most good things are." He leaned forward. "That's why I wanted to talk to you. Really talk." She set her cup down. "Okay. I've been trying to rebuild things," he said. "For Sophie, for myself, and somewhere in the middle of all that, I found you." Her breath caught. "I didn't expect it," he went on. "But I think the most important things aren't planned." She said nothing, just listened. "I don't want to rush this," he said. "But I also don't want to walk away from something that feels—" He hesitated. "Like hope." Margaret felt her heart stutter. "You're not a project, Margaret. You're not someone I want to fix. You're someone I want to learn." She looked down. "And what if I'm not ready?" "Then I'll wait," he said softly. "But I'll wait beside you, not behind you, not in the distance." There was silence between them for a long moment, the kind that wasn't empty, but sacred. Then she said, "My chair isn't temporary, Caleb. I know, and my scars physical and otherwise they don't come off like a coat." "I know." Her voice wavered. "I don't want you to fall for a version of me you made up in your head." "I'm not," he said. "I'm falling for the woman who challenged me in court, who told me I was worth a second chance, who lets my daughter believe in the impossible." Margaret's throat tightened. "And what if I let you down?" He reached across the table, not touching her, but resting his hand palm up between them. "Then we figure it out." It wasn't a grand gesture, it wasn't poetry, but it was everything. She reached out slowly, placing her fingers in his. And just like that, the rain outside didn't feel so lonely. Later, they sat in the sunroom with Sophie curled on the rug, coloring. "Did you two kiss yet?" she asked casually, not even looking up. Margaret choked on her tea. Caleb turned crimson. Sophie peeked up with a grin. "You don't have to." "I just thought maybe it was that kind of story." Margaret laughed, really laughed for the first time in too long. "Let's write a different kind of story, okay?" she said, brushing a strand of hair behind Sophie's ear. Sophie grinned. "Okay, but mine has dragons." "Well then," Caleb said, "I guess we better get ready." They stayed like that, three souls in the middle of something sacred, while the rain faded into sunlight, and the room felt warmer than it had in years. No promises, no finish lines, just presence, and maybe, just maybe, the beginning of something neither of them had the words for yet. But they'd find them. Together. The leaves had begun to change, brushing the streets of Asheville in amber and rust. Autumn arrived like an artist, quiet, sure, and full of slow magic. Margaret sat outside in her garden, her blanket wrapped around her knees, the worn pages of a poetry book open but forgotten in her lap. Her hands rested on the soft wool, but her thoughts drifted somewhere else entirely. Caleb had started his new job that morning. He'd kissed Sophie's forehead at sunrise and promised to be home before dinner. He hadn't kissed Margaret, not yet. And strangely, that felt right. They were still learning each other's rhythms, still building the bridge between trust and affection. She wasn't afraid of where it was going. She just wanted it to be real. She turned a page without reading it, then heard the voice that always brought a smile before it even arrived. "Miss Whitlow, I brought you a cinnamon roll, but I took a bite out of it by mistake. Sorry." Sophie marched across the garden path, holding a bakery napkin like it was royal treasure. Margaret smiled. "That's all right. You brought the best part." Sophie sat cross-legged in the grass, crumbs already dusting her sweater. "Dad said to tell you he made it through the first day and didn't fall off any ladders." "Well, that's reassuring." Sophie pulled a folded note from her pocket. "He also told me to give you this, but only after I told you something first." Margaret raised a brow. "And what's that?" "That I don't get scared at night anymore." Margaret tilted her head. "Really?" Sophie nodded. "Not since you came to court. It made everything different." Margaret felt the lump rise in her throat before she could stop it. "How so?" "You made people listen," Sophie said. "And when people listen, they stop being afraid of what they don't understand." The wisdom in that tiny voice knocked the air right out of her. Sophie handed her the note and skipped back toward the house, singing to herself about dragons and judges and cinnamon. Margaret unfolded the paper. "You've changed the air around me. I'm breathing again. Dinner tonight? Just us?" There was no signature. But there didn't need to be. That evening, Caleb showed up, carrying takeout, and looking nervous in a way that wasn't performative. It was endearing. He wore a navy button-down with sleeves rolled and hair still damp from the shower. "I wasn't sure what you liked, so I brought Thai and Italian and one salad just in case." Margaret laughed softly. "Covering your bases, huh?" He smiled. "I figured the odds were better if I over-prepared." They sat in the dining room, candlelight flickering between them. Sophie already tucked in upstairs with a bedtime story, and Miss Velma babysitting for the evening. Margaret reached for the pad thai. "How was the first day?" "Busy. Honest work. No one knew who I was. No one whispered behind my back. That must have felt strange." "It did," he admitted. "But freeing, too." They ate in silence for a few minutes, the kind of silence that had settled between them often lately. Comfortable, open, but buzzing with something unspoken. Eventually, he set his fork down. "Can I ask you something?" She nodded. "If the accident hadn't happened, if your life hadn't changed, do you think we would have met like this? Like this version of us?" She thought about that. Longer than expected. "I think I would have been too proud," she said finally. "Too guarded, too polished to ever let anyone like you see the cracks. And now? Now I know the cracks are the only places where the light comes in." He looked at her like he was memorizing the line. "I want to build something, Margaret," he said. "Not just for Sophie. For us. But I won't rush you." She stared at him. At the man who once stood in her courtroom, broken and brittle. At the father who tucked in his daughter with lullabies and fixed porch steps with borrowed tools. At the soul who somehow reached hers without ever asking her to be anything other than what she already was. "I want to build it too," she whispered. The candle flickered between them. He reached out, not a grand gesture, not a pull or a lean, but simply set his hand on the table, palm up, open. She placed hers over it. And for the first time in a long, long time, she didn't feel like a woman remembering what she'd lost. She felt like someone finally stepping into what she'd been waiting for. A knock came at the door. They both looked up. On the porch stood two people Margaret hadn't seen in years, a local journalist and a man from the bar association. Caleb stood to answer. Margaret wheeled forward to meet them. The journalist smiled stiffly. "Judge Whitlow, we're doing a feature on community transformations. We were hoping you might speak about the Morris case. It's been getting attention." The bar rep cleared his throat. "And there's been some conversation about reinstating your full judicial authority, including circuit-level appointments." Margaret's eyebrows lifted. "Really?" "Yes, ma'am. There's been admiration for your courage, your choices." She looked back at Caleb. He gave the tiniest nod. She turned back. "Tell them I'll think about it." Then she smiled. "But tonight, I've got company." She closed the door softly and turned toward the table, where her life finally was beginning again. The sun dipped low behind the Smoky Mountains, casting the valley in a golden hush. It was one of those evenings where everything seemed to breathe a little slower, as if even time had decided to take a breath. In the garden, the old oak stood tall, branches swaying gently in the fall breeze. Beneath it, a small crowd had gathered. Close friends, neighbors, faces that had watched Margaret Whitlow rise, fall, and somehow rise again, not to power, but to something truer: love. The ceremony was small by design. Margaret didn't want gowns or attention. No fanfare. Just meaning. She wheeled herself down the flagstone path, a soft cream shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her silver hair pinned back with delicate combs. Sophie had chosen from a thrift store. Caleb stood near the oak, hands folded nervously, suit a little wrinkled, but smile absolutely unshakable. Sophie waited beside him in a pale yellow dress with a crown of dried wildflowers in her hair. She held a wooden box with 2 rings inside, one plain, one etched with tiny olive branches. Velma played the piano from the porch, humming along with every note. Margaret reached the front, heart steady but full. She looked at Caleb, not the man he used to be, not the man others saw, but the man who showed up every single day and stayed, the one who rebuilt a life without ever asking for applause. He reached for her hands. "Hi," she smiled. "Took you long enough." He grinned. "Had to be sure you were real." The officiant, an old friend from law school who now ran a local outreach center, kept things short. That's how they'd wanted it. "Marriage," she said, "isn't about perfection. It's about presence. It's choosing someone not because they're flawless, but because even in their cracks, you see light." Margaret's eyes shimmered. Caleb looked at her like he was already home. When it came time for vows, he went first. "I used to think second chances were earned," he said, voice quiet but sure, "that I had to climb some impossible mountain to prove I deserved one. But you taught me that grace isn't earned. It's given. You gave me grace when I couldn't give it to myself. And somehow, in the middle of all that, I fell in love with you." Margaret took a breath, and the wind seemed to still. "I built my life around control," she said. "Around order, safety, power. But none of that ever made me feel known. And then you walked into my courtroom, into my house, into my world, and suddenly, it wasn't about control. It was about connection. About love that's messy and inconvenient and holy all at once." Sophie stepped forward with the box, holding it like a sacred thing. They each took a ring, slipped it onto the other's finger. The officiant smiled. "By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife." Caleb leaned forward, kissed Margaret's hand, then her forehead. The crowd clapped softly. A breeze rustled the trees, and in the golden stillness, something settled: peace, joy, the sweet weight of finally being known and loved exactly as you are. Later that evening, after the cake had been cut and Sophie had twirled herself dizzy under the porch lights, Margaret found herself back in the garden, now lit with hanging lanterns and soft laughter echoing from the house. She watched as Sophie crouched beside the oak, digging a small hole with a spoon. "What are you up to, Miss Whitlow?" Margaret asked, wheeling closer. Sophie looked up, dirt on her nose. "I'm planting something." "Oh?" Sophie nodded. "It's my mom's locket." Margaret blinked. "Your mama's? Are you sure? Sophie nodded again, more serious this time. It's for the next little girl who comes here. The one who thinks her prayers don't work. Margaret swallowed the lump in her throat. She'll find it, Sophie whispered, and she'll remember that love is real. Margaret leaned over and helped her press the dirt down gently. Will you tell your dad? She asked. Nope, Sophie said. This one's just between us girls. They sat like that for a while, moonlight filtering through the branches above, the weight of past pain somehow lighter now. Behind them, Caleb called out, You two coming in? There's still pie. In a minute, Margaret called back. Sophie looked up at her, eyes wide and clear. You think miracles are just big magic things? Margaret smiled. No, sweetheart. I think miracles are people. And choices. And the quiet moments when we say yes to love, even when it's hard. Sophie leaned her head against Margaret's arm. Good. 'Cause this, she motioned to the stars, the oak, the lights behind them. This feels like a miracle. Not because of the words, but because for the first time in her long, carefully lived life, she didn't need proof anymore. She had love. She had family. She had enough. And sometimes, that was the biggest miracle of all.